Podcorn is a marketplace connecting podcasters to amazing podcast sponsorship opportunities, such as host-read ads, interview segments, topical discussions, and more. With Podcorn, there is no middleman. Podcasters of all sizes can browse and choose opportunities right on the platform, set their own rates, and collaborate with brands directly without any exclusivities. You scroll through the many advertisers, send them a message, and tell them why your podcast would be a great place for their advertisement. This marketplace gives podcasters creative freedom and full control of how and when they monetize. Podcorn will support you at every step of the way to ensure you're protected and compensated for the work that you do for brands. Explore sponsorship opportunities and start monetizing your podcast by clicking the link in my show notes to sign up for Podcorn. Go to podcorn.com to get signed up today.
This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt Podcasts. Sorry for the delay in publishing this episode. With all the additional stress from the pandemic, I was having a hard time with true crime. Every time I sat down to write this episode, I had to stop. I've had a bit of downtime now, and I'm ready to get going. But over the next few episodes, I'll probably try to keep it lighter and stay away from the real heavy cases. And I hope you're all doing well. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. You're listening to episode 22, Rachel Timmerman. Tim and Velda Timmerman had their daughter Rachel Helena on April 6, 1978. She was the couple's second of 4 children. Rachel grew up in the typical Midwestern middle-class household of the 1980s in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The family didn't have excessive amounts of income or resources, but they always had their basic needs met. Clothes and toys were always used and were hand-me-downs or garage sale purchases. The Timmermans lived in the country and grew much of their own food. Velda was continually canning vegetables, fruits, and jams. She even made her own ketchup. The family experienced a few events, which quickly acquainted them with feelings of anger, sadness, and loss. Rachel was molested by her babysitter when she was only 5 years old. She told her parents, and they reported the incident to the police. Charges were never filed, and nothing became of the situation. This was followed up with the loss of Rebecca, the Timmermans' 4th child. She died of sudden infant death syndrome, which is sometimes referred to as crib death. The cause is not well understood. The Timmermans eventually moved out of the country and graduated to an upper-middle-class existence in the suburbs of Grand Rapids. Tim and Velda had a 5th child in June 1986, who was born with cognitive and physical disabilities. In the summer of 1988, the couple decided to part ways. The Timmerman kids went with their mother, and they all stayed at her friend's home temporarily. Then they transitioned to camping at Gun Lake, which was south of Grand Rapids. Eventually, their dad, Tim, took the kids from Velda, and they moved into their aunt's home. During that time, Velda went to see her family in California, but got sick and stayed with them for a few months. Velda got healthy and moved back to Michigan, but found herself in the middle of a custody battle. Tim was awarded full-time guardianship of the oldest 3 children. Their youngest one with disabilities was sent to live with a foster family. He unfortunately passed away at age 19. When Rachel turned 11, life began stabilizing again. Her father started dating a woman named Lynn, whom he ultimately married. Velda's new love interest clicked well with Rachel. Velda dated him on and off until his death in 1995, which was another hardship Rachel endured. In high school, Rachel had a positive pregnancy test after only dating someone for a few months. Her daughter, Shannon Dale Verhaeg, was born on June 15, 1996. Rachel didn't want to marry her boyfriend, even though he was a good person. She just wasn't sure if she was in love with him. On August 6, 1996, Rachel had a rare night out when her sister was kind enough to babysit her daughter Shannon. Rachel had an unconventional friendship with a disabled war veteran named Wayne Davis. He had little money and lived with post-traumatic stress syndrome, but he had a heart of gold, and Rachel adored him. That night she went to his house to play cards. A contractor named Brian Anderson showed up for the game, as did a man named Marvin Gabrion, who had his nephew Mike in tow. After an intense evening of card playing, which included Marvin grabbing Wayne by the throat, Rachel needed to get home because she had to get back to her daughter. Wayne was going to walk her home, but Marvin insisted that he would give everyone a ride. Rachel, Wayne, and Marvin's nephew Mike got into the car. Instead of taking Rachel home, Marvin drove past her house. He stopped off on a dark road where he kicked Wayne and Mike out of the car. Marvin continued to drive, and Rachel knew that she was in a bad situation. He pulled over and walked Rachel out into the woods. She initially complied with Marvin because she witnessed his temper earlier in the evening, and it frightened her. After walking a short distance, Marvin forced himself on her. Thoughts of compliance went out the window, and Rachel's stress response kicked in. She fought and screamed for her life. Rachel told Marvin that he would rot in jail. In response, Marvin grabbed her head and repeatedly slammed it into the ground. He also bit Rachel's nose so aggressively that blood filled up her nasal passages. She stopped fighting him and gave in because he was going to kill her. Rachel needed to stay alive for her daughter Shannon. Marvin raped her a few times that night. Rachel was able to dig deep and muster the strength she needed to convince Marvin that she liked him. He agreed to drive them back to her mom's trailer. As they pulled up, Rachel jumped out of Marvin's car and luckily ran through the unlocked door of the trailer. Wayne and Mike were already there, waiting for Rachel, having walked there after they were booted from the car. Rachel ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and picked up a hammer that was laying on the floor. Marvin entered the home, but Wayne was able to get him to leave. It was 3:30 a.m. before the nightmare was over. Rachel told her sister what happened, and the situation scared her. Marvin promised that he would kill her daughter and then her. Rachel's sister convinced her to call the police, and in the morning, Rachel had a sexual assault exam performed at the hospital. Some officers with the Newaygo County Sheriff's Department knew Marvin Gabrion. His rap sheet included assault, robbery, burglary, and many DUIs. When law enforcement looked for Marvin to arrest him, they couldn't find him anywhere. The detective left a message around town that he was looking for Marvin and to pass it on. He thought Marvin was such a narcissist that he would surface sooner or later. Sure enough, Marvin faxed a statement to the detective. His version of the story was miles away from Rachel's. Rachel, Wayne, and Mike left after the card game in Marvin's car. Rachel offered to give him oral sex, so he let everyone else out of the vehicle. Once they drove a little further and parked, she performed oral sex on Marvin and then put his semen inside of her. Rachel asked him to have sex, but he turned her down. Marvin's car got stuck when they were leaving. Rachel got out and helped push the car, but hurt herself. When they got back to the trailer, Rachel realized she was bleeding and became upset. Police disregarded Marvin's story and charged him with third-degree criminal sexual assault. But it would be months before they would find him. During this time, Rachel had reported to jail herself. Someone had given Rachel marijuana, but she was pregnant, and she decided not to smoke it. She thought she'd save it until after she had the baby. Police caught Rachel with the weed and worked out a deal where she took probation. While on probation, someone called in a tip that Rachel was throwing parties with alcohol. Her parole officer found a few empty liquor bottles in her garbage can and sent her up to jail for a few months for violating her probation. In January 1997, Marvin was finally arrested, and the warrant listed 3 witnesses for the rape: Rachel Timmerman, Wayne Davis, and Mikey Gabrion. The judge set Marvin's bail purposefully high. $75,000 was a substantial sum of money for most people who lived in that county. Marvin's lawyers got the bail reduced to $40,000. His parents put together that money, and on February 3, 1997, they released Marvin from jail, which would put many people's lives in jeopardy. Marvin's first order of business was to visit Wayne Davis. On February 12th, one of Wayne's friends saw Marvin and Wayne working on a car together. On February 13th, that same friend was supposed to give Wayne a ride to jail. He had to serve 90 days from a DUI conviction. Wayne was nowhere to be found. She went back again a few days later, and this time there was a note on Wayne's door. It said he left for California because he was afraid to go to jail. Inside the house, all of his belongings were there, minus some missing stereo equipment. Most notably, his army jacket was left behind, and Wayne never went places without that jacket. Wayne Davis was never seen again after that time period. Meanwhile, Marvin was busy filing all the serial numbers off the stereo equipment so he could sell it. Rachel was released from jail on May 5th, 1997, and went to live with her dad and his wife. The preliminary hearing for the rape trial wasn't far away. She was set to testify against Marvin on June 5th. Rachel ran into Marvin a few times around town, and she was so terrified that she called police. She wanted to avoid him at all costs. Rachel started receiving calls from a man named John Weeks. He persisted in asking Rachel to go out with him. On June 3rd, 1997, 2 days before she was set to testify, Rachel went on a date with John. She left her dad's home in Cedar Springs with her daughter because John asked her to bring her kid along. Rachel's dad hugged them as they left, not realizing that would be the last time he saw his daughter and granddaughter alive. On June 4th, many people reported seeing Rachel, Marvin, and another male about an hour from Cedar Springs in the Oxford Lake area, which is part of the Manistee National Forest. A female witness saw the trio driving in an old truck, towing a boat. There were 2 men, with one blonde woman sitting between them. The witnesses also felt that the driver was angry. Witnesses Pearl and Bob Hall saw the old pickup as they headed to Oxford Lake. The truck was driving fast, and the driver appeared to be mad. This sighting was prominent in Pearl and Bob's memory because Bob had to drive into the bushes to avoid an accident with the old truck. Another witness saw Marvin with the truck, towing a boat, and recognized the blonde woman was Rachel. On June 6th at 3:30 a.m., Marvin's neighbors woke up when they heard banging and metal scratching on cement. They saw Marvin dragging his boat across the ground, and he apparently filed off the boat's registration numbers. He loaded his truck with life vests, cinder blocks, chain, and attached the boat to his truck trailer. A few days later, Marvin and John Weeks approached campers at Oxford Lake and asked if they could store his boat at their campsite, explaining it wouldn't fit at his own site. One camper agreed to store the boat, but found that Marvin was awkward. He seemed nervous and didn't talk much. Marvin was missing patches of hair, he had scratches on his face, and bruising under his eye. The weather was warm, but he was wearing gloves. When this camper later stopped at Marvin's campsite to look for firewood, he noticed that there was plenty of room to store the boat. Right after Rachel disappeared, John Weeks told his girlfriend he was going to Texas with Marvin to buy drugs. He said he'd be gone for about a week and a half. It was a few weeks later, and John had not returned. When John's girlfriend asked Marvin where her boyfriend was, Marvin said he dropped John off in Arizona with some friends. John Weeks was officially considered missing on June 22, 1997. A few days after Rachel was last seen, several people received handwritten letters from her, namely the judge and the prosecution who were working on the rape trial, and her dad, Tim. In the letter to Tim, Rachel said that she met the man of her dreams. She was going to marry him, and she was going to be gone for a few weeks. In a second letter to Tim, Rachel said she and Shannon were in Little Rock, Arkansas, staying with a man named Delbert, and they might just live there. Tim was confused because he thought the person Rachel went out on the date with was named John. The whole situation was not making sense. In the letters to the prosecutor and judge, Rachel asked for the charges to be dropped against Marvin because she made up the entire story. Marvin turned her down for sex, and she made up a lie to teach him a lesson. She put his semen inside of her. She pinched herself to create bruising, and the bite on her nose was from a puppy, not from Marvin. Rachel said that she was now with a man who was an honest Christian. She couldn't allow an innocent man to be locked up. The prosecutor dropped the charges after reading the letter. The dots wouldn't be connected until later, but all the letters Rachel sent were in envelopes that contained a holographic stamp of a space station, which were of the same variety as the letters Marvin used when he wrote to his family. On July 5th, 1997, two fishermen were trying to launch their boat from a mud ramp in Oxford Lake. They saw something floating in the water about 100 yards out. When the men pulled out their binoculars, the object almost appeared human. When they drove the boat out to investigate, the object looked like a mannequin or dummy in the water. But the fishermen were assaulted with a pungent odor, and they knew the object was a human. The person was floating face up, with a concrete block attached at the waist, and their clothes were still intact. The police were called, and they identified the body as being Rachel Timmerman. Her eyes and mouth were covered with duct tape, but the perpetrator left her nose uncovered. Someone had handcuffed her wrists behind her back. There was a metal chain with 2 padlocks that were attached to her waist and left leg, and a second concrete block was attached to her body by a chain. She was alive when she was tossed into Oxford Lake, where she drowned to death. Gas built up in her body, which caused her to float back to the lake's surface. Rachel's body was found close to private property, but was technically located 227 feet inside Manistee National Forest, which was federal land. Michigan did not have the death penalty, but a case like this would be tried in federal court, where the death penalty would be on the table. Rachel's funeral was held in Cedar Springs on July 17th. She was a caring person and was a fantastic listener. Tim and Lynn received condolence letters from Rachel's cellmates in prison, even though she had only spent a few months there. Tim ended up corresponding with one inmate who was close with Rachel. Rachel told her about the intimate details of her rape. She said Rachel would not have written those letters or dropped the charges against Marvin. Law enforcement started searching for Marvin Gabrion. They searched his home and found the keys that went with the padlocks that were attached to Rachel's body. Police found concrete blocks at his home that had the same paint and tar spots, which matched the concrete blocks attached to Rachel's body. Police had Marvin's nephew take them to the campsite on Oxford Lake that was often occupied by Marvin. When they arrived, Marvin's tent was still there. On the campsite, they found a woman's hair clip, lengths of chain, bolt cutters, and a silicone nipple that could be used on a baby's bottle. We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Best Fiends. As you all know, podcasting about true crime is sort of my thing. But even I need an occasional break, and my go-to game is Best Fiends. Best Fiends is a puzzle game that you can play on your phone, and it's pretty sweet because you go through all these levels, solving challenging puzzles that actually engage your brain. But it's a laid-back game that anyone can play. The amazing thing about it is that it doesn't take up much of your time, but it's great in that it fills up those moments where you wish you had something going on, since many of us are sitting around our homes just looking to be entertained right now. You also don't need an internet connection to play. Best Fiends updates the game monthly with new levels and events, so it never gets old. Engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must-play. Download Best Fiends, free on Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. Now, back to the show. Michigan police were searching for Marvin at the same time as Michigan FBI agents were investigating him for stealing Social Security checks from a man named Robert Allen. Robert was an alcoholic from Grand Rapids who also had a mental disability and was missing since 1995. Marvin received a driver's license from Indiana in Robert Allen's name in July 1995. The following year, Marvin opened a bank account in Robert's name. He also opened a post office box in Sherman, New York, and had the Social Security checks mailed there. Marvin had almost taken $14,000 of Robert's Social Security money. The FBI was watching Marvin when he headed to his post office box in New York to pick up Robert's check. The FBI's SWAT team arrested Marvin on October 14, 1987, at the post office. The plot thickened when law enforcement found another driver's license on Marvin from a Virginia man named Ronald Lee Strevels. A month prior, Ronald was looking through a newspaper and spotted an advertisement for a job opportunity. He responded to the ad, and his interview was held at a truck stop in Columbus, Indiana. His interviewer asked all kinds of personal questions, including information about his parents. Robert thought that the whole meeting was strange, but the rationale given was that this information was needed for a new type of tax form. Copies of his driver's license and Social Security card were made. A few days later, Ronald received a call, letting him know that he didn't get the job. Ronald was unaware that the interviewer was Marvin Gabrion, who obtained a Virginia driver's license in Ronald's name. Now that the FBI captured Marvin, they convicted and sentenced him to 5 years in prison for Social Security fraud in July 1998. The following year, on June 3, 1999, Marvin Gabrion was charged with the murder of Rachel Timmerman. Marvin underwent several psychiatric evaluations. Most of the evaluators believed that Marvin was pretending to be mentally ill. One doctor diagnosed him with an antisocial personality disorder. She found him to be aggressive, manipulative, impulsive, and irritable. He was the definition of a sociopath and was found competent to stand trial for all 7 evaluations. Marvin had not always lacked empathy, even with a rough beginning to life. Marvin Sr. and Elaine Gabrion welcomed their 5th out of 6 children, Marvin Charles Jr., on October 18, 1953. The family lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Abuse and dysfunction were normal in the Gabrion household. Marvin Sr. didn't trust his wife and doubted that he was the father to any of his children, and they fought verbally and physically. Sometimes the parents would just take off and leave the children to fend for themselves. When Marvin was only 4, they made him fight one of his older brothers as the whole family watched and cheered. One time, Marvin Sr. repeatedly slammed Marvin Jr.'s head into a wall until one of his brothers intervened. Another time, Marvin Sr. refused to take Marvin to the doctor when he was sick, but his fever got out of control and they eventually took him in. Physicians diagnosed him with such serious pneumonia that he had to have surgery to remove the damaged tissue from his lungs. At age 12, Marvin's brothers held him down on the ground and tried to smash his head with rocks. One of Marvin's brothers even fired a gun in his direction. The Gabrions were poor. Marvin's mother took the children with her to help siphon gas from other people's cars. The family moved to Walhalla, Michigan, into a cabin that Marvin Sr. built. All 6 siblings shared a single room with a curtain that divided the space. They later moved to White Cloud, Michigan. The home was so squalid that chickens walked in and out of the house. Marvin wore hand-me-downs that included dirty socks with holes and shoes that were several sizes too big and were split down the back from wear. Many of his classmates teased him, and he often ate alone in the lunchroom. When Marvin was younger, they described him as quiet and shy. He had empathy and cared for his cousin who had mental disabilities. Marvin took care of his grandparents, and he loved his nieces and nephews. He even tried to protect kids who would get picked on. Marvin played basketball, football, and ran track. He had a high IQ of 121. Marvin's decline started after he entered high school. He had been in several motorcycle crashes. He had gone through the windshield of a car. During a carjacking, he was hit on the head with an object. And he was hit on the head with a baseball bat during a fight. There were 14 head injuries in total. After high school, Marvin moved to several places, Colorado, Arizona, and Washington, but he moved back to Michigan in 1979. Upon his return, family members noticed a pronounced change. He drank excessively, had unhealthy paranoia, and started running scams. In 1992, when Marvin was riding with his friend to the liquor store, he wanted to know if his friend had auto insurance. Once the car insurance was confirmed, from the passenger seat, Marvin grabbed the steering wheel and forced the car off the road. At that point, no one was injured, but Marvin jumped out of the car and started slamming his body against trees. An ambulance was called, and Marvin had a CT scan in the emergency room. Later on, Marvin sued his friend and told them to go along with the plan, and they would split the profit. In 1993, they evaluated Marvin at Hope Network's Brain Rehabilitation Program. After 2 weeks of testing, he showed he had borderline impairments in memory and moderate impairments with attention. But because of his high levels of irritability and agitation, he was a poor candidate for the program. The doctor also recognized that Marvin had an incentive to do poorly in the testing because it would grant him benefits. When the doctor looked over the CT scans from his fake car accident, there were no signs of brain injury. By the time 1996 rolled around, Marvin had been arrested for drunk driving 9 times. Finally, in fall 1997, the FBI had Marvin in custody and planned on extraditing him back to Michigan to be charged with Rachel Timmerman's murder. Marvin tried to argue that the federal government did not have jurisdiction over the southern part of Oxford Lake where Rachel was found, and they should not try him in federal court, but the government ruled against him. Marvin began writing a series of letters to Rachel's father to improve his legal position. He desperately tried to avoid the death penalty. Even with all the heartbreak Tim experienced, he wrote back to Marvin. Each sentence was carefully crafted to persuade Marvin into revealing where his granddaughter Shannon was located. One of Tim's letters to Marvin read like this: Marvin, my wife and children don't want you to call my home. That's why I have not sent my phone number. My head is not stuck in the sand. I told you a long time ago, if you help me, I'll help you. The government asked me what I thought about the death penalty. I told them, if Mr. Gabrion will tell me where my granddaughter is, then let's just skip it. You're right, Marvin. I have everything to gain. I lost Rachel. I lost Shannon. I want to believe that Shannon is alive. What do they do to baby killers in prison, Marvin? You help me, I'll help you. Tim. Besides all the letters he wrote to Tim, Marvin sent taunting letters to Rachel's sister, Sarah, and Shannon's grandmother, Kim Verhaeg. He sent a letter to his neighbor Charles, who he did not get along with. Marvin accused Charles and his wife of killing Rachel and hiding Shannon. The stakes were raised because this was a death penalty case, and selecting jurors was difficult. But both sides agreed on 6 men and 6 women who made up the jury, and the trial started on February 25, 2002, in Grand Rapids. The prosecution believed that Marvin killed Rachel to stop her from testifying about the rape. The supporting evidence included that Marvin threatened Rachel directly. He killed her right before the hearing. He told other inmates that he killed Rachel. And Wayne Davis, who was supposed to testify for Rachel, was missing. Plus, there were the letters that Marvin sent to the prosecutor and judge, pretending to be Rachel and asking for the charges to be dropped. The prosecution explained how Rachel was bound and dumped into Oxford Lake while still alive. They explained how Oxford Lake was a shallow, swampy body of water with lots of vegetation. Rachel's body could not be carried to another spot by the current, therefore was dumped on federal land where she was found. The judge allowed the prosecutor to talk about the disappearances of Wayne Davis, who was with Rachel the night she was raped, and John Weeks, who likely witnessed her murder. There was some evidence that Marvin had something to do with Shannon's disappearance, since the baby bottle nipple was found at his campsite. Shannon was seen with Rachel when she disappeared, and Marvin told a few people that he killed Shannon. He told the inmates at the prison that he killed the baby because he didn't know what else to do with her. Robert Allen was also introduced to the jury, how Marvin stole his identity, cashed his Social Security checks, and then Robert disappeared. There was just not enough evidence to charge Marvin with the crimes related to Wayne, John, Shannon, or Robert. Neurologists testified for the prosecution and said that there was no evidence of Marvin having a brain injury. Many witnesses testified about Marvin's violent personality. 2 people were in a disagreement with Marvin, and their homes were both subsequently set on fire. One woman said that Marvin sexually assaulted her in her home and refused to leave until a gun was pulled on him. One witness walked home from the grocery store, and Marvin gave him a ride. To repay the kindness, the man invited Marvin to come inside and play cards. The witness had to stop the card game to give a family member his daily medicine. Marvin told the family member that he wasn't getting his pills and he was just going to die. Marvin then accused the witness of kicking dogs, which the witness had never done. Marvin took their family collie and threw the dog against the wall. He started kicking and choking the witness. The wife and son tried to help, but the beating continued until Marvin got tired and laid on the couch. The family fled the house and called the police. Marvin had several violent disputes with his neighbor Charlie. One time, Charlie asked Marvin to leave his house. Marvin left, but took out his rifle and fired a shot at Charlie's home. Marvin also took Charlie's dog and told him the dog had died. One of the most severe incidents was when Marvin took a knife and golf club to Charlie's home and threatened to kill him and his wife. Even the other inmates in jail felt threatened by Marvin. He started a fire in his jail cell. He would collect needles and razor blades and make weapons out of them. He kept his chicken bones from dinner and tried to make a prison shank. Marvin threw urine and feces at prison guards. The defense didn't have much to work with, but tried to argue that Marvin did not commit this crime. The defense team argued that because no mud was found in Rachel's lungs or nasal passages, that they could not be sure she was drowned. Marvin originally tried to represent himself, but the court ruled against it because he could not follow rules or meet minimum standards of behavior that were expected in the courtroom. Marvin had been a handful to deal with up until that point. He had over 40 major infractions while he waited for his trial in jail. Marvin called one of his attorneys over 80 times one day. He often called court staff or sent them letters. Marvin would not give his attorneys any information they needed from him. He was so obnoxious in court that the judge kicked him out and only allowed him back if his arms and legs were restrained. Marvin sent the judge letters saying that his lawyers were trying to frame him and were satanic. He called the judge an evil Hitler and a pedophile. Marvin said that the judge impregnated a teenage girl. He freely insulted the jury. Against his lawyer's recommendations, Marvin testified at trial. He claimed that John Weeks and another friend of Rachel's chained the blocks to her body, handcuffed, duct taped, and killed her. They then took Shannon to Philadelphia and adopted her out. He claimed that Rachel's body floated from the private side of the lake to the government side of the lake, and that this should not be a federal death penalty trial. It only took the jury 4 hours to find Marvin guilty of Rachel Timmerman's murder on March 5, 2002. During the sentencing phase, the defense did everything they could to save Marvin from the death penalty. They brought up his childhood, his alcohol and drug abuse. From sniffing glue as a child to hard drugs when he got older, and all the accidents and injuries that created his violent behavior and antisocial personality disorder. On March 11, 2002, Marvin jumped out of his chair and punched his lawyer in the face because he wanted his lawyer to object to something, but the lawyer did not comply. Ironically, 20 minutes prior to this, his lawyer stated that Marvin's behavior could be controlled with medication. Marvin was immediately restrained, and the judge ordered a stun belt be placed on him, which was a device with the capacity to deliver electricity to a prisoner who was unruly. From that time forward, he had to sit between two marshals. Marvin did not perform any better at his sentencing hearing. He said that he received training from the CIA, the Rangers, and the SEALs, and would take something like sodium thiopental to prove it. Marvin called all the witnesses who testified against him pedophiles. He tried to persuade the jury that no matter where they sent him, he would be in heaven, and they would have to live with their choices for all eternity. On March 16, 2002, the jury had little problem recommending Marvin be made eligible for the death penalty. Marvin Gabrion had the honor of being the first person to receive the federal death penalty in a state that was a non-death penalty state. Marvin appealed to the Sixth Circuit U.S. Court because his defense team could not tell the jury that he wouldn't face the death penalty had they prosecuted him in state court. His death sentence was overturned on August 3, 2011, because some jury members might not have opted for the death penalty had they been privy to that piece of information. His conviction was upheld, but he was supposed to receive a new sentencing trial. This 2011 decision was reviewed in May 2013, and it was decided that Marvin's original conviction and sentence would stand, since the court ruled that Michigan lacking a death penalty was not a mitigating factor when arguing a death penalty case. Even years later, through the appeals process, Marvin was still highly motivated to write letters, to the point where the appeals court wrote that he could not meet the minimum standards for court, let alone meet the standards of civil society. Marvin is still on death row at Terre Haute U.S. Penitentiary in Indiana, but was not on the list of 2020 executions. He is still the only defendant sentenced to death in Michigan under a federal statute. A year after they lost Rachel, Tim and Lynn Timmerman became foster parents and cared for 10 children. John Weeks and Robert Allen were never found and are presumed deceased. A few months after Marvin's trial, Wayne Davis was found in a lake by Marvin's home. No charges were ever filed. Tim worked with the Unsolved Mysteries team to try to get traction to find baby Shannon. She was only 30 inches and 30 pounds when she disappeared. She had a strawberry birthmark on the back of her neck, blonde hair, and blue eyes. Shannon was wearing a diaper and tricolored dress. Her nickname was Pumpkin. Shannon has never been found. Marvin has admitted nothing, and she's presumed deceased. Her picture can be found on charlieproject.org under the name Shannon Dale Verhaeg. It showcases a computer-derived progression picture of what Shannon might look like at age 16, on the off chance that she is still alive. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit beyondcontemptpodcast.com for links to the sources used in this episode. This episode was researched by Haley Gray. Scriptwriting, editing, and all audio production were performed by me. Special thanks go out to new patron, Stephanie D. If you like the show, please leave me a favorable review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much, everyone.
To slow down, undefined, we put our flame upon ice, but she burned out. All I want close to